Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Lamed Hey. We're going to finish the third parak today, start the fourth parak. I hope you'll feel like you can breathe a little better because you'll see that these sugyot, and not to say that we're not going to get back to some of the Yevamot and all the different relationships, but the dapim are definitely getting more to the standard dapim of Gemara that we are more familiar with. Okay, we're starting with the end. I'll repeat the last part of yesterday's daf, which is, one second. Okay, the last part of yesterday's daf, we saw Shmuel, and we're now going to see two different versions of Shmuel. We're going to have a lot of mirroring today, where we're going to kind of see the same thing, but in a bit of a different version, in a bunch of different ways. It just happens to be coincidental. In today's daf, there's a lot of them. So Shmuel, in yesterday's daf, we were talking about this waiting period of 3 months, which again happens in many, many instances, where in order to determine who the future child may be, we make sure the woman waits 3 months so that right before getting remarried, after, let's say, getting divorced, or husband dying, we want to wait that period of time so that we know that if she ends up having a child, we'll know who the child is. It's not a 7-month baby. Otherwise it'll be a concern. Maybe it's a 7-month baby to the new husband, or a 9-month baby to the old husband, and we won't know who the child actually belongs to, which has all sorts of ramifications. So Shmuel makes this comment, which we're not exactly sure what it's referring to and kind of who's excluded. We'll see. V'kulam, now starting 6 lines from the bottom of yesterday's daf. We learned this already, but we'll review. V'kulam tzricha lamtin shlosha chodashim. All kind of situations, we don't really know what he's referring to yet, have to wait 3 months, other than a giyoret u'mishucheret ktana, other than a minor who is either a convert or is a slave who ended up becoming freed from slavery, right? Remember, this is a Canaanite slave, or an Ovei Kochavim slave, who eventually becomes, right, when they become your slave, they become somewhat Jewish. When they get freed, they become fully Jewish. So before she can get married to a regular Jew, which she's now allowed to, she has to wait 3 months. So here, if she's a ketana, she doesn't. So if they're minors, remember, we learned already that minor girls, according to the rabbis, couldn't get pregnant, right, under the age of 12. So now they say, but if she's a minor who's a Jew, she has to wait the 3 months, which we're going to have to figure out why. But before we figure out why, we're going to have to figure out in what scenario. So if it's that she did miyun, that her mother or brother married her off, and then she betrothed her, and she just wanted to get out of that marriage, and she's allowed to by just saying, I don't want to be here. Hamar Shmuel de lo baya. Shmuel already told us in a different situation, she doesn't need to wait 3 months. The ibiget, because she's a minor. Ibiget, if it's a divorce, he already said she needs to wait the 3 months. If it's from divorce, right, miyun is a unique halacha that it's not even like she's really divorced. But once she's divorced, she actually has to wait the 3 months, even though she's a minor, and even though there's really no concern she's pregnant. And that we're going to see when we see the other case where Shmuel obviously meant it here. It's because we're worried that if we allow her to get remarried, we might accidentally allow women who are of age to get married as well immediately. And therefore, it's what we call a gzera, right? Forbade this because of that. But in any case, even if that's what Shmuel's referring to, it doesn't make any sense, because Shmuel, there's this concept. Shmuel told us somewhere else. He's obviously not telling us the same thing he already told us. So therefore, it can't be get, even though that would work, it would make sense, but it can't be because he already said that at a different time. Where do we know he said this? Damar Shmuel, because he said, he said exactly that. Miyun, you don't need to. If you refuse to be married to this man, you say, not interested, you get out of the marriage, you can get married tomorrow. But you need 3 months, in which case, when Shmuel said it here, he couldn't possibly be referring to that. So therefore, they say, Ela biznut. It must be that, now whether she was engaged in prostitution, or maybe this means she just slept around with somebody. So it's that kind of situation that he said she needs to wait 3 months. And why? Because the rabbis made a gzera because she's a minor, and even though she's a minor, because you might confuse the situation, and if people see that she did this, then they might think a gdolah can do it, and therefore we don't allow it. Again, not just she doing it, meaning the court allowed her to, or the rabbis allowed her to. They might think a gdolah doesn't need to wait, and they were very concerned about that issue. So according to this version of Shmuel, he was gozel. They made a takana that even minors if it's prostitution, and obviously also get, it's just that wasn't what his comment was about. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, really, we do this? Why? And not only why, but we're going to see from our Mishnah that we don't make a gzera on the ktanot. What did it say in our Mishnah? Remember our crazy case? 2 brothers betrothed 2 sisters and then went home with the wrong one, slept with the wrong one. And then we say, if she was a gdola, you have to wait 3 months because maybe she got pregnant. We had the whole discussion yesterday. How could she have gotten pregnant if she was a virgin? And then we now say, the Mishnah said, if she was a ketana, she can go back to her original husband right away without a problem. So now the Gemara says, so if we have a reason to be gozer ketanot atu gdolot, why weren't we gozer in our Mishnah? Why did our Mishnah distinguish between the 2 cases? So Amar Gidol Amarav, he answers a very strange answer. Hora'at sha'a haita. It was a one-time event, and they made a gzera in the case of our Mishnah as a one-time event, but it wasn't something that was going to happen very often, and it wasn't something that was going to be for generations, and no, it was a one-time thing. So now think about our Mishnah. What was our Mishnah? Our Mishnah was a theoretical case. If 2 men betrothed 2 women and they mixed them up and blah, 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 blah. Right? We didn't think this was an actual case. Hora'at sha'a means, right, it's when all sorts of things they explain as a hora'at sha'a, like sometimes in the Nevi'im things happen and you're like, what? How could that be? And they say, oh, it was hora'at sha'a, they had to do it. Or sometimes the Gemara brings a story of something that happened in the time of the Tanaim, and they say, oh, it was hora'at sha'a. It basically means it was a one-time thing, very unlikely that thing will happen again. And they made, there was a reason at that moment they had to decide to do that, and don't worry about it. So the Gemara asks, Michlal dahafai? Are you trying to say that situation actually happened? Right? This is when you're all looking and saying, that's an absurd case. What, would it really happen? Even the rabbis say, what? That actually happened? That wasn't a case. That was a theoretical case to discuss all these possibilities. It didn't actually happen. But you could say this was a hora'at sha'a, and they said, oh, a ketana didn't need to get remarried, didn't need to wait to go back to her husband because it was this one-time thing. What are you talking about? So they say, well, what we meant was, it's not that it was a one-time event. It's that the case in our Mishnah is so theoretical that it's very unlikely going to happen. And if it does, it's certainly not a situation that we're worried that you'll take a lesson from there and learn to other cases, because it's such a unique case and it's so unlikely that it's going to happen. That when cases are unlikely going to happen, we don't make a gezerah. So that's why our Mishnah says that if, for whatever, if by chance this case should happen to happen, you can let the ketana get married right away, because we're not worried that you're going to learn from here to other things. Or even if we were worried, the rabbis don't institute their gezerot in a case where it's unlikely. So this is a very unlikely case. Okay, there you have it. The Gemara has admitted that some of the cases they bring up are very unlikely to happen, and therefore there's no reason. That's the whole first version of Shmuel. But now we're going to bring a different version of Shmuel. Lishana achrina amrela. There are other people who bring a different wording of what Shmuel said. And here goes. Amar Shmuel, kulan tzricho lamtin 3 chodashim, chutz migiyoret u'mishuchrechet. So far it sounds the same, right? 3 months, except for a convert and a freed slave, a maid servant or a maid slave. Gdola, not ktana. In the first case, we said, oh, we're not gozer on the giyoret and mishuchrechet ktana, right? And there you could say maybe, right, we're gozer on a regular Jewish woman, atu gdola. But Meshucheret and Shifcha, Meshucheret and Gioret are in a different category. We don't need to worry about their ketanot. We don't need to make a gzera for our gdolot because that's a unique case. But here he says, even a grown woman, okay, who's a Gioret and Meshucheret, doesn't need to wait 3 months. Aval ketana bat Yisrael ena tzricha lamtin 3 chodashim. But not, right, sorry, now, if that's the case, basically Shmuel's saying, Giyoret Meshucheret Gdola don't need to wait for 3 months. And also, okay, there's whether this word aval appears or not, but also a ketana, who's a Jewish ketana, doesn't need to wait 3 months either. Okay, when it talked about the Meshucheret in the previous, they were the ketanot, and then kind of they were exceptions to the rule. Only those minors don't need to wait. In this version, they don't need to wait if they're gdolot, but no ktanot ever need to wait. And that fits very nicely with the fact that ktanot don't generally get pregnant, right? They don't get pregnant according to the rabbis ever. And therefore, there's no reason to worry about the 3-month period. So now again, though, they say we have to go back to the statement of Shmuel. Remember, Shmuel said, miyun, you don't need to wait if they refuse. If it's a get, they do need to wait. So we're going to again ask, b'mai, what is Shmuel referring to? And again, it's going to be the same as the last one, but with a minor change, because it'll have to be, like last time we said, if it's get, he already said they need to wait 3 months. This time it's going to be, if it's miyun, he already said they don't need to wait, because now Shmuel is saying Tana doesn't need to wait. And if it's miyun, that's the case. He already said hadazim. Ibn miyun ha'amar Shmuel hadazimna, right? Shmuel already said, if you do miyun, you don't have to wait 3 months. So it doesn't make sense. He would say it again here. He wouldn't repeat himself. And ibe get, it can't be get. They don't need to wait because Shmuel actually said they need to wait. Hakam Shmuel debaya, that he already said they need that waiting period. So again, we're going to say, right, and now we're going to bring the statement Shmuel said, just in case you didn't know it, because assuming this version didn't really have the last version. Ta'amar Shmuel mi'anabo enat tzricha lamtin shlosha chodashim, natan laget tzricha lamtin shlosha chodashim. This is where Shmuel said it, that if she refused to stay married, if she was under 12 and the mother or brother married her off and it was only a kiddushin derabanan, then Shmuel said she doesn't need to wait 3 months. And if he gave her a get, then she would need to wait the 3 months. So again, what do they say? Ela b'znut. It must be znut, and znut b'ktana lo shachiach. What's the reason? This is the opposite of what we said before. Before we said znut, we make a gzera on znut. In this version, there's no need, because how many minors are engaged in prostitution? Again, as soon as you say something is lo shachiach, not very common, then there's no need to make any sort of gzera. So therefore, they allow a ktana who is involved in znut to get married right away, because it's a very uncommon case. And there's no reason to worry that if we allow it there, right? Well, and again, this idea of lo shachiach is, even if maybe people would confuse the law and then think if Gdolah could get married right away, it doesn't matter. The rabbis just don't make zerot in cases that are super uncommon. It's just not the way it works. So now, what do we have left to explain? Why is the Giyoret and Mishachoreret Gdolah, right? Why don't they need to wait 3 months? Don't we need to know, right? Maybe they slept the night before with somebody else before they converted. So they say, right, and if you're going to say the whole thing is lo shachiach, Giyoret and Mishachoreret shchiach behuznut. Okay, there's this assumption of the rabbis. Now you might say, certainly with our modern eye, that is not so appropriate to just say, oh, anyone not Jewish, likely they're engaged in prostitution. We would never say such a thing. But again, first of all, you have to remember the culture they lived in. And the culture they lived in, there really was in the Roman world and the Greek world, there was a lot of prostitution going on and orgies and things like that. So it's actually not crazy for them to assume this assumption. Again, nowadays, well, you can argue whether it would be true or not true. And again, what do you call prostitution, right? So anyway, I'm not going to get into that whole thing, but the point is, you can assume that maybe they were sleeping around with somebody, and therefore ligzor, they should forbid them. So why is a giyor and mishprer gdolah? Why don't you have to worry about this 3-month waiting period that maybe they're pregnant from before? So the answer, a very interesting answer. Huda Amar ka Rabbi Yossi. He holds like Rabbi Yossi. Okay, let's see Rabbi Yossi. Tanya says in a bright hagiyoret vashvuya vashifcha sheniftu. They add another one to the category, which is someone taken into captivity, where there's a concern that they were raped in captivity. And a shifcha sheniftu, right? So we have the giyoret and the shifcha that was redeemed, v'shenid gairu, v'shenishachreru. Okay, so either they were freed, they were captive and freed, they were a Canaanite slave that was freed, became Jewish, or a giyoret that converted. That's not the opinion we're looking for. We're looking for someone who says they don't need to wait. Rabbi Yossi, who's the one we're going to hold by, matir le'ares u'linaseh miyad. So we basically say Shmuel must be holding like Rabbi Yossi. It's very nice, but it doesn't really give us an answer as to why. So comes Rabbah. Amar Rabbah, my time of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbah explained Rabbi Yossi's explanation, right, Rabbi Yossi's opinion, which is then going to explain Shmuel, because Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi. Kasavar isha mizana mishameshet b'moch kedei shelo titaber. There's an assumption that these women who are sleeping around are going to use birth control. Okay, they put in a moch, which is, they put something physical in their body, okay, like a tampon type thing, which is going to stop the semen from going into their bodies in order to prevent them from getting pregnant. Now, the question is, why can we assume that they use birth control? So Amalei Abai, I understand as a woman who's converting. Now, people don't convert in a minute, right? They go through a process. So a woman within 3 months before her conversion, she already knows she's planning to convert. So I understand why she's going to be using birth control. Kevan, because she's planning to convert. She protects herself. She wants to distinguish, she wants to basically get pregnant when she's already converted, because she wants to have that zera be Jewish from the start, rather than, right, a woman who's pregnant. When she converts, she goes in the mikveh, the tefillah actually counts for the child. Okay, the child still, let's say it's a male, needs a brit milah when they get out, but then basically the tefillah is done. So theoretically, the child will be Jewish no matter what. But they say that child will be considered a convert rather than a born Jewish. What's the relevance? So one of the things that's the most relevant is that, again, what do we say? Ger shenitgayer ki katan shenolad, like newborn. So that means that they're not related anymore to their relatives. So if she has children after that, they'll all be siblings with each other, but this child won't be considered a blood sibling, right? Like a sibling halachically of the other children. And she'll want them to be. So she'd rather, that's possibly one of the reasons why she'd rather wait to have the child born b'kedusha. You could say maybe also just in her mind, it just, it feels more right for her. Maybe there's no halachic issue involved. So there's an assumption that she's not going to get pregnant right before she converts. And that's why we're going to assume she's using birth control. What about the shvuya v'shifcha? Also, nami, we assume the one woman in captivity is going to know that she's right, that she's going to be freed, and the shifcha is going to know that she's going to be freed. Okay, that's interesting. I don't know if you knew 3 months in advance, but the assumption is they know that they're nearing the end, and therefore they're also going to protect themselves. But someone, this is a classic thing you have a slave. If you accidentally knock out a tooth or injure their eye or something like that, you break a bone in their body, they'd go free. So now that's something they have no way of anticipating, that they're going to go free. So maybe they have relations and didn't use birth control because they didn't know that they were about to be freed. So the chitema calls it maybe in that case, Rabbi Yossi will agree with Rabbi Yehuda that you have to wait for 3 months. Not true. But it says in the Mishnah, if you were raped or seduced, you need to wait 3 months. Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi, now, rape, obviously, you have no way of knowing what's coming. You have no way of using birth control. So how could you say that, right? Here, Rabbi Yossi clearly thinks something that comes upon you unexpectedly, you still don't have to wait 3 months. So what's the reason? So Abaye changes a little bit about what we said before. And he says, Isha mizana mitapechet shelo titaber. Okay, this is an interesting method of birth control. She flips over in order to have the semen come out of her body so that she doesn't get pregnant. So now, and that's something you could do after, that's something you would do if you were raped, right? That you would try to come up with, right? There are ways that people, right? You can put something in after, right? There's certain methods that are not foolproof, not that any method of birth control is foolproof, but there's an assumption that even if it comes unexpectedly, Rabbi Yossi assumes that you're going to use a birth control, some sort of method you're going to turn over and try to have it come out so that you won't get pregnant. And that's why we don't have to worry. Okay, so all of these people, we're going to assume that they've done that. The idach, why don't the rabbis agree with this? Because they say it might not work. So therefore, you still have to worry. You still have to wait the 3 months. That's why Rabbi Yehuda really disagrees with Rabbi Yossi. So that we have the two versions of Shmuel, whether the main difference is, does he think a ketana, if she was mazneh, right, she had a relationship out of marriage, does she need to wait the 3 months before getting married? Even though she can't get pregnant, we might be gozel because of a gedola, or do we say no? Okay, and then that affects also whether we say a Gioret, a Meshucheret, Ktana doesn't need to wait, but a Gdolah would need to wait, or maybe even a Gdolah doesn't need to wait according to Shmuel in the second version, because we assume that they're using methods of birth control. By the way, the answer, I just want to point out, I didn't really figure out an answer to this, but the answer they give in the end that she turns over is very good for the rape case, but it's not really good for the Shem Ba'ayin, because if she, let's say, had a relationship with someone a few weeks before, and then she's automatically Yotzei B'Shem Ba'ayin, it's too late to use that method of birth control, right? And we assume she didn't use it before, so it's not a perfect answer. Okay, last part of this before we finish this chapter, and the last part of this Mishnah, the last line wasn't really so clear. If they were Kohanot, which sounds like the daughter of a Kohen, then they can't eat Truma. So what does this mean? So first the Gemara says, Kohanot in Yisraeliyot lo. Sounds like if they were Yisraelite, they could continue eating Truma. So that doesn't make any sense. So you should say, Imayu Nishei Kohanim. What it means is if they were the wives of Kohanim. So if they were a wife of a Kohen, they can no longer eat Truma because they slept with, right? They were a married woman who slept with someone in between. Then they're exempt, they're disqualified from eating Truma because of that. Even though it wasn't their fault, still they become disqualified from Truma, just like they have to get divorced from their husbands also, we learn. So now they say, wait a minute. Neshei Kohanim in, Neshei Yisraelim lo. What do you mean? What if they were married to a Yisrael and then ended up getting divorced or their husband dies and then they want to go marry a Kohen? They're also nifsal min hakuna in that case, okay? And they're also nifsal truma, okay? How do we know this? So it doesn't matter what their status is now. Are they married to a Kohen or a Yisrael? It matters if they're interested in any point in their lives anymore in marrying a Kohen, they're going to have an issue because they had this problematic relationship when they were a married woman and ended up with some other man. So, this was said by Rav Sheshet, and as Rav Sheshet told us, and I was enlightened by learning it in our Mishnah as well. Okay, the wife of the Yisrael that was raped, even though she can go back to her husband, she can't ever marry a Kohen. Okay, so right, because a Kohen can't marry a woman who was raped, basically. Again, raped from if she's already married. Okay, that's very important. Here it's talking about rape of an Eshet Ish, okay, of a married woman, not if it's rape of a non-married woman. So Amarava Hachikama, Imayu Kohanot Nesuot LiYisrael Nifsalu Min HaTchuma Debein HaShayu. Now we go back to explaining Kohanot really means what the simple reading was. They're a Bat Kohen, but what's the issue? The issue is not what we saw before, which is they can't eat Truma in their house because that even a wife of a Kohen, and not necessarily even if she's the daughter of a Kohen, and daughters of Kohen also might be married to a Yisrael. So what does this mean? This means if she's married, she's a Bat Kohen, she was married to this man, she ended up, accidentally sleeping with his brother, right? They got flipped at the wedding. And then what happens? Then he dies or divorces her. She goes back to her father's house. Generally, the daughter of a Kohen can go back to eating Truma in her father's house. This woman cannot ever go back to that scenario. She can't go back to eating Truma in her father's house. She can live in her father's house, but she can't eat Truma. And with that, Hadran alach arba'a achim, and we're now starting the fourth chapter. So the assumption based on what we just learned really is that after a man dies, childless, now we're back to Yibum, and they want to do Chalitza or Yibum, they have to wait 3 months. Why do they have to wait 3 months? Okay, this mission is going to be premised on the assumption that you're supposed to wait 3 months to see maybe the wife is pregnant. Generally, they only knew people were pregnant after 3 months because then they started showing. They didn't have pregnancy tests like we have nowadays. So they would wait 3 months. And then they would see if she's pregnant, then they wait out the pregnancy to see, is she giving birth? If she gives birth to a healthy baby and the baby survives the first 30 days, exempt from Yibum and Chalitza. Okay, if she doesn't survive the pregnancy, she has a miscarriage, the baby lives only for part of the first month, doesn't make it, that's called not a ben kayama, then she's actually going to be obligated in Yibum or Chalitza. And obviously, if the 3 months pass and she's not pregnant, then also Yibum and Chalitza are going to kick in. So in our case, in our Mishnah, we have a case where hacholetz liyivim tov. He did chalitza right away. He didn't wait. V'nimtzeit me'uberet. And it turns out then, right, let's say he does it the first week, right? Some people like to get things out of the way and done. He does chalitza. And now all of a sudden, a few months later, she becomes pregnant. V'yalda, and then she has a baby. Bizman shavlad shel kayama, if the baby makes it, meaning survives the first 30 days, hu mutar b'krovotea. You have to remember this whole discussion of this Mishnah was in a time, I mean, obviously we still have these things going on nowadays, but in those days, it was much more common that children would either, right, women would miscarry, children would die within the first 30 days. So now, hu mutar b'krovotea, v'hi mutar b'krovav, v'lo psalam in akuna. So I see you're asking, what if any of the wives found to be pregnant? It doesn't matter, okay? The question here is, what's the status of this chalitza? Is this chalitza valid or not, right? Now, what does it mean valid? So she's pregnant and the baby survives. So obviously they didn't need to do chalitza. So we basically act as if there was no chalitza done. Now, what's the ramifications? Remember, we learned the chalitza is like divorce. Because chalitza is like divorce, we have all sorts of chumras about chalitza. So, for example, you become forbidden to all of her relatives. Okay, we're going to see this coming up, that he's forbidden to her relatives, she's forbidden to his relatives. We treat it like divorce. Okay, so now, maybe we didn't discuss this yet. It might be coming up. So now, and the other thing is, she's a chalutza. Now, what did we learn about a woman who's a chalutza? A Kohen can't marry a woman who's a chalutza. So now, right, I see you're writing, Miriam, exactly. So now, what do they say here? If the baby survives, and then there was no need for chalitza, then what the chalitza action was totally irrelevant. It was as if they never did chalitza. So he can marry her relatives, she can marry his relatives, right? He muteret b'krovav, v'lo psalam in akuna, and she can go marry Kohen if she wants, because it was as if there was no chalitza. But what if ein havlad shel kayama? If the baby doesn't survive, hu asur b'krovotea, v'yasura b'krovav psalam in akuna. It sounds like, and I say sounds like because we're going to see a bit of a different interpretation going through. Sounds like what? Sounds like the chalitza done originally was valid, right? And therefore, all the laws of chalitza kick in. What's missing here? Well, that she doesn't need to do chalitza again, right? But basically, it sounds like he can't marry her relatives, she can't marry his relatives, and she's psulam and akuna because the chalitza was a valid chalitza. Okay, so even though on the timeline, she did chalitza, then she was pregnant, which basically should have nullified the chalitza, but since the baby never made it, the chalitza retroactively was valid from the beginning. That's at least one way of reading this Mishnah. You're going to see that it's not so clear how to read this, but right now that's how we're reading it. What if he actually did yibum with her? Now here there's going to be more ramifications, because if it turns out that there was a child, then they're going to be a little bit messed up, because then she was never allowed to marry him in the first place, and it's Isur Erva. So, right, because it's his brother's wife he married. And then she turns out to be pregnant, Yalda, and she has a baby. They basically get divorced, but you don't even need a get, because the whole yibum was totally invalid. And what happened? She married Eshet Achiv, right? He married Eshet Achiv. He married the wife of his brother. She married her, right? She's now married to the guy who was her husband's brother. Forbidden for both of them to get married. Isur Karet. And then what do we always say? Kiddushin and Kiddushin Tovsim. There's no Kiddushin. So you don't even need a divorce, okay? But you basically separate immediately. The chayavim b'korbanim, you have to bring a sin offering because you did something, it was by accident, but it was a big accident. Vim ein vlad shel kayama. If the baby never made it, you can stay married. It was all, again, sounds like retroactively, it was all valid. Safek, and then you basically fulfilled yibum, it sounds like, already. Safek ben tisha l'rishon, safek ben shiva l'acharon. What if we're not sure if the child born is 9-month baby? Let's say you do it 2 months later, and you now have a baby, and you don't know, is it a 7-month baby to the new husband or a 9-month baby to the old husband, or it could be, you got married the day after, and we don't know which one it is. The point is, we just don't know who it belongs to. It's possible it could belong to the first husband. Yotzi. So now you have an issue, because maybe you needed to do yibum, but maybe you didn't. So because maybe you didn't, and maybe you're sleeping with someone you're married to someone you might not be allowed to be married to. We don't know, right? If the baby was born, then if the baby was the first husband's, you're forbidden to be with this husband. So therefore, yotzi. But the vlad is kasher, because no matter what, the child's not a mamzer, because either it was the first husband, which is totally fine, or if it's not the first husband's, then you were obligated in Yibum, and then you did the right thing, and then the baby was born to the second husband. So either way, the baby's fine. There's no psul, there's no problem with the baby's yichus. And in this case, since they're not sure if they did an avera, you do what's called a hanging guilt offering. I'm not sure if that's the proper translation of it, but Asham Taloi is hanging, basically. It means this is something you bring if you're not sure if you did a sin that normally requires a chatat, a sin offering. You do this guilt offering, which is a hanging guilt offering. What does it do? Until such time that you figure out who the baby, right, or whether you did something wrong or not. In this case, you'll never figure it out unless you live nowadays and you could do DNA testing. But in those days, there was no DNA testing. There was no way to ever know. So what do? You want to get atonement for your possible sin, but it's not a definite sin. So you don't bring a sin offering. You bring this hanging guilt offering, which basically gives you atonement until such time that you actually figure out if you did something wrong. In the event that you figure out you actually did something wrong, you have to actually bring the chatat. But in this case, you'll never really find out. So your Asham Taloi basically gives you atonement till such time that you die. Okay, so now we're going to start with the machloket in the Gemara, between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish in the Gemara, and we're going to have to try to connect it to our Mishnah. We're going to we're going to learn their opinions. We're going to explain their opinions. Then we're going to bring the basis for their opinion. Then we're going to start bringing questions, and we're going to have different versions of, was the question that Rabbi Yochanan asked Rish Lakish? Was it a question of Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan? And we're going to kind of read it all in the mirror image. So Itmar, it was said, introduction to Machloket and Mora'im, HaCholetz leme'uberet v'hipila, which is basically a similar case. She miscarries. It doesn't really make a difference if she miscarries or the child is born and doesn't survive, okay, for these intents and purposes. If she miscarries, so again, he did the chalitza, then it turns out she was pregnant, then she miscarries. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Eina tzricha chalitza min ha'achim. Okay, I think someone just asked this question. So Rabbi Yochanan says, she's fine. She doesn't need chalitza anymore from the brothers because her original chalitza took care of it, even though she really shouldn't have done it. And even though it turned out she was pregnant, which seemed to be that it would maybe undo the chalitza. Now, retroactively, since the baby never happened, goes back to the original chalitza and it's fine. Rish Lakish Amar, tzricha chalitza min ha'achim. She needs chalitza. Now, by the way, it could be her, it could be a sister, right? It could be another wife. But basically, they need to do chalitza again. That first chalitza didn't count. Now, this seems counter to the way we learned the Mishnah. And that's why I said very specifically when we learned the Mishnah, I'm reading it in one particular way because it's the simple way of reading the Mishnah. It doesn't really seem to go with Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says, now, there's a big debate. I'm not going to get into it. When it says, tzricha chalitza min ha'achim, does it mean from the other brothers and she can no longer do chalitza with the one she did it with originally, or even she could do it with the one she did originally? It's kind of off the daf, so I'm not going to go into it. But there is a machloket exactly who she can do chalitza with in this case. So now we're going to explain. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Eina tzricha chalitza min ha'achim. Why? Because chalitza me'uberet shma chalitza, ubi'at me'uberet shma bi'ah. If you do chalitza when you're pregnant, it actually is valid. You do bi'ah, you have relations with him to do the mitzvah b'yibum. It's effective, again, only in the event that in the end the baby doesn't make it. But it is effective. That first one was effective. Okay? Rish Lakish Amar, tzricha chalitza min ha'achim, because chalitza me'uberet lo shma chalitza, ubi'at me'uberet lo shma bi'ah. Says that was totally invalid. It wasn't anything that you did because she was pregnant. And there's no chiyuv yibum. So any chalitza or yibum that you did is irrelevant. So you have to start from the beginning. So now they're going to say, what's the root of their machlok? Some people say it's based on a pasuk. Some people say right on an explanation, on a verse. Some people say it's based on logic. So we're going to start with the second one. First, Rabbi Yochanan savar im yavo Eliyahu. Eliyahu is the one who always knows what we don't know. If Eliyahu were to come, v'yomar, right, at the moment you did chalitza, before you knew she was pregnant, and he told you, tahadi abla mipule mapla, he's going to say, listen, by the way, the woman's pregnant, but she's going to have a miscarriage. So now, Mila bat chalitza v'yibumu, right? Wouldn't you be able to do yibum right at that moment, or chalitza, because you know that there's no child, basically. So hashtanami tigali milta l'mafra. So since theoretically you could say that, we basically go back and we say, okay, so even though you didn't know that, but that's what basically happened. She was pregnant. She had a miscarriage. We just basically say whatever you did in the beginning, it's as if that didn't happen. Now, Rish Lakish, what's his logic? Rish Lakish we don't say, now I was thinking about this in an emotional way, right? When a woman has a miscarriage, God forbid, right? It's not like you say, okay, I'm back to square one. So, like I'm back to where I was a few months ago before I was pregnant. Of course you're not. You're a different person. You've gone through an experience that's traumatic. That's right. You can't just undo that whole thing. There was potential for life. The husband almost, right, didn't need to do yibum. Yes, she miscarried, but we don't just look at it as if this never happened and we just go back and say, okay, your chalitza was fine. No, there was a potential for life here. That meant that you weren't actually obligated in yibum yom. So when you did yibum and chalitza, it wasn't anything because you weren't really obligated. Now, you didn't know that you weren't obligated. You thought that you didn't even think that she was pregnant, but that's really not considered anything. Some people say it's a verse. Rabbi Yochanan savar uben enlo amar Rachmana. It all depends. Does he have a son? Does he not have a son? Rabbi Yochanan looks very matter of fact. In the end, he didn't have a son, right? It's true. He potential for a son, but there was no son. So in the end, the chalitza was valid because in the end, really, he didn't have a son. Rish Lakish saval uben enlo ayen alav. Remember we saw this? Look and see. Maybe there's a son somewhere out there. Meaning, at this point, there was potential for life. So at that point, if you had looked, you didn't see that she was pregnant, but if you had looked well and you had checked, she was pregnant and there was potential for life there. And therefore, your chalitza was totally invalid because you didn't do that ayin alav. You didn't really check. So now we're going to start with our Mishnah and use our Mishnah to basically support Rabbi Yochanan because that's what our Mishnah seems like. So Rabbi Yochanan l'Rish Lakish. Look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, if the vlad is not, doesn't survive, the fetus, right? Then the chalitza is a valid chalitza. So bishlama ledidi damina chalitza muberet shma chalitza. Mishum hachi psala. He's focusing on the part about psala min hakuna. Why is she disqualified from kiuna at that point? Because what? Because the chalitza is a good chalitza. That's why. But you say the chalitza wasn't relevant at all. So why can't she marry a Kohen? Her chalitza was meaningless according to what you're saying, Rish Lakish. So Armalei, what's Rish Lakish's answer? Why is she disqualified from kiuna? It's just a chumrah. Really, her chalitza was invalid. But what? Well, she actually did an act of chalitza. And what does that look like to the outside world? The outside world maybe won't know that in the end, she was pregnant and had a child and the child just didn't make it. They might not see that, but they did see that she did chalitza. So because of that, they'll think that a chalutza can marry a Kohen, right? We don't want people thinking that. So therefore, they made a chumrah here. So that's Rish Lakish's answer. Now we're going to do the mirror image. We're going to take Rish Lakish. We're going to say Igad Amrei. Some people say that Eitavei Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish is going to question Rabbi Yochanan from our Mishnah. Now, this is a little more difficult because it's not the way we read the Mishnah that kind of fits with Rabbi Yochanan. So here he's going to say the following. Ein avlad shel kayama, same line. Hu asur b'krovotav yasura b'krovav upsala min hakuna. So now he says, and I gave you a little bit of a hint to this when I read the Mishnah. Bishlama l'didi da'amina chalitza mu'beret lo shma chalitza. Hainu dekatani psala min hakuna. What elements are they focusing on? She can't marry his relatives, he can't marry her relatives, and she's disqualified from kuna. And that's all l'chumra. Those are all just chumras. But what doesn't it say there that basically disproves your point, Rabbi Yochanan? V'lo katane einat tzricha chalitza min achim. It doesn't say she doesn't need to do chalitza again, okay, which Rish Lakish takes that to mean she does need to do chalitza again. In other words, we're going to be machmir and don't allow her to marry Kohen, but of course she needs chalitza. That was invalid. According to you, Rabbi Yochanan, the main halacha here is that her chalitza was valid. If her chalitza was valid, she doesn't need chalitza from the other brothers anymore, from even that brother anymore. Again, I told you on the machloket, how you understand that machloket rishonim. But the point is, it should have said the words, she doesn't need chalitza. That would have been a better way to say it. So Amrle, Rabbi Yochanan says, Inachinami, it obviously means she doesn't need chalitza. Why didn't it say it? Well, I did Tani Resha lo psala, Tani Seifa psala. The first case, when the baby does make it, we said she's not psula min akiuna. Right? Obviously, it doesn't say there anything about chalitza because obviously she doesn't need chalitza. There's no chiyuv chalitza anymore. So therefore, in the second part, it said psala. Basically says for literary reasons, this is the structure of the Mishnah, and that's why it pointed out the psula min akiuna and not the chalitza part. But obviously, it meant you don't need to do chalitza. Second question of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, and again, we're going to have his asking Rish Lakish using that, and then Rish Lakish flipping in the second version and using it against Rabbi Yochanan. In the case where you did yibum and then you find out she's pregnant and then the baby doesn't make it anymore, you can stay married. According to me, you think that this will all keep going. So, that's why it says yikayem. Okay, so I see I might have frozen, so I'm going to go back for a minute. Rabbi Yochanan asked Rish Lakish the following question. He says, when it says in the Mishnah, Ein avlad shel kayama, you can stay married. So comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, this makes perfect sense to me. Who says chalitza is valid retroactively. And that's why you can stay married, because you already did yibum, just stay married. But lididachta amar chalitza muberet lo shma chalitza. Ubiyat muberet lo shma biyat. But you say it's not valid retroactively. What should it have said in the Mishnah? Yachzor v'yiv'ol v'kayem mibayat. It should have said he has to go and have relations with her again in order to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. And then he can stay married to her, right? But it should have said that. So comes Rish Lakish and says, that's not a question. Ma yikayem, what does yikayem mean? Yachzor v'yiv'ol v'kayem tilosagi. And some people say tilosagi b'lav hachi. There is no other possibility, according to Rish Lakish. He says, what possibility do you have? So Rashi explains, if you look at the Rashi about 8-10 lines from the bottom of the page, why? If she doesn't do bi'ah afterwards, again, this is all Rish Lakish's. It won't be enough if he just gives her a get, because they already were living together, right? And he didn't do the mitzvah of yibum yet. So you can't just give her a get and be done, because get doesn't undo chiyuv yibum. So get's not an option. Now, he would have to have relations with her again, because he can't give her a get to get her out of it. He can't, right? It won't, he can get her out of the marriage with it, but it won't fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. I just skipped a little bit. You can't do chalitza because you have relations with her. Once you have relations with her, he's not allowed to do chalitza. Chalitza is only if you decide not to do anything with her, but he already did something with her, even though it's not a valid yibum, it prevents him from doing chalitza with her. So basically, the only option is leave olo tashniya, right? Another time. And therefore, Rish Lakish says it's just obvious. You didn't even need to say it. Some people say that it was actually the reverse, the way the question went. So Bishlam Didi makes sense to me. Again, all that was done retroactively is not valid. That's why it says yikayem, which is telling you yachzol v'yiv'ol v'yikayem. You have to go back, have relations with her a second time to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, actually, and then you can stay married to her. Because there's no other possibility. Ela ledidach, according to you, there are possibilities. Ratza yotzi, ratza yikayem. If he wants to, he can divorce her at this point, because he already fulfilled yibum according to you. So if he wants to, he can divorce her at this point, or he can stay married to her. That's what it should have said, Mibaile. It should have said in the Mishnah, Ratza yotzi, Ratza yikayem. So Rish Lakish says, according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, the wording of the Mishnah doesn't match your opinion. So again, in Achinami, Rabbi Yochanan says, you really could have stayed married to her, or you could have divorced her if you wanted. But just like Rabbi Yochanan said in the first one, it's just to match the language. In the first case, it said you have to immediately leave, split up, because if you don't split up, you can't stay married to her because it's Esharach. So therefore, in this case, it said Yikayem, which was the opposite of Yotzi, and that's why. Okay, last question for today, Meit. Now the Gemara brings a question. So those were two mirror images of, right, taking parts of our Mishnah and kind of one reading them to prove his point and the other reading it to prove his point. Now we have a Meit today, a question from a Braita on Rabbi Yochanan. Exactly our case, right? He marries her, and then turns out she was pregnant. Okay, her tzara can't be married. Okay, you can't marry her tzarata. Shema yehev la ben kayama. Because like, the tzara is stuck now, because maybe the child will survive. So now they say, wait a minute, the child will survive. If the child will survive, of course the tzara can go marry anyone she wants. So adraba, ki yavev la ben kayama miftara tzarata. So they say, okay, wait, sorry, we made a mistake. The way the Braita should read is Ela Ema Shema Lo Yehav La Ben Kayam. If the Vlad is not Ben Kayama, the Yibum they did now is obviously not valid, because the concern is that Tzara can't go get married yet, because let's say the Tzara didn't get married right away. So now they did Yibum with one of the wives. Now the wife is pregnant. So now we don't know, right, if the baby's going to survive. If the baby doesn't survive, then they're obligated in Yibum, and what they did originally doesn't work. That's Rish Lakish, that's against Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it should work fine. If you say that retroactively the Yibum will be valid, then the Sarah can go get married, because no matter what, she's permitted. So Amar Abaye is now going to change Rabbi Yochanan, which Rav is not going to be happy with. Amar Abaye, everyone agrees that you're not patur from bi'ah. Ki pligi b'chalitza. Rabbi Yochanan tzavar chalitza muberet shma chalitza, bi'ah muberet lo shma bi'ah. We're now changing Rabbi Yochanan to fit with this. If you do bi'ah, you can't say retroactively it was good. Only chalitza retroactively works. Rish Lakish tzavar bi'ah muberet lo shma bi'ah, b'chalitza muberet lo shma chalitza. Rish Lakish holds, right, neither of them work. So Amalei Rava, Manavsha, what are you talking about? Either way you look at it. Ibiyat muberet shma bi'ah, chalitza muberet shma chalitza. Ibiyat muberet lo shma bi'ah, chalitza muberet lo shma chalitza. In other words, they go hand in hand. Why do they go hand in hand? Last line for today. We've already learned that in order to do chalitza, it has to be there was potential for yibum. In order to do yibum, there has to be potential for chalitza. That means the two go hand in hand. That means if you say that retroactively the chalitza was good, you're going to have to say retroactively the yibum was good. So you can't say that to answer the question. And Rav is going to bring a different answer, which we'll see in our shiur tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.